talk about mindfulness, affect, helplessness, and if I get to it, intimacy, and maybe even a little bit about sexiness. So I'm going to borrow from a very talented man, Meng Tan, who gave a great presentation in 2012. And he started out his presentation talking about coming across a man in a field on a horse. And the man comes up to him on the horse, and he asks the rider, "Where are you going?" And the man on the horse, the rider says, "I don't know. Ask the horse." And it really sums up what I'm going to be talking about, because a lot of the times, even though we've got these amazingly developed brains, what we don't have is knowledge of the horse. A talented rider can get a horse to do just about anything: jump through fire, jump over things, jump into water, all sorts of amazing events. An untalented rider will be dragged behind the horse, will be bucked off the horse. And our brains are basically the same thing. We have basically our reptile monkey brain, which all our stimulus comes in through. And then we have our neocortex, which is our frontal lobes, neo being new and cortex being part of our brain, that tries to control it. And so mindfulness it's really backed up by neuroscience. And why it's important is that the horse is much more powerful than the rider, but a talented rider can get a horse to do anything. And that's where affect comes in. So all our senses all come in through our reptile monkey brain, except for smell, but I'll come back to that. That's why smell is so evocative of feelings. And then it gets processed, so it's stimulus, affect, response. And this was first studied by Charles Darwin, 1872. And he studied the face for the first time and wrote about it. Later, in 1962, Sylvan Tompkins wrote about it. He wrote impenetrably, unfortunately. Even though I've been a neuroscience major since '91, it was really hard to get through his work. And then after that, we had Ekman write about it in '72, and then later he wrote about lying, which is interesting, which is what our last presentation was about. And then later on, this guy Gottman in '92 wrote about it in the terms of marriage, and he was able to predict whether people would get divorced within the first year of marriage, just based on their facial displays, which they codified. So I'm going to teach you about basically how affect works. And affect is innate. There's 9 affects. And you have them from birth. And you're largely unaware of them. They correspond to facial displays and physiological responses in your body. And the physiological responses correspond to your autonomic nervous system, which is basically, you've got 2 things. You've got the sympathetic response, which is gas, and then you've got the parasympathetic, which is brake. And what's interesting is you're taught from a very early age not to look at the face, even though it unconsciously really transmits quite a bit. So affect is the unconscious expression of what's going on, and then feelings are what you label it, and then mood is kind of what the meaning you put to it. So I'm going to run you through it as quick as I can. Let's see what I can do, because it's a bit of I'm a little embarrassed by the title again. So that's one of the affects. It's shame, which you might see by the redness of my face a little bit if you're paying attention. So the first affect is fear, and that corresponds to that's a sympathetic response. And that is the pit in the stomach, which of course I have a little bit standing in front of all of you. And its blood goes away from the stomach, the heart rate increases, respiration increases. It shunts the blood to your muscles so you can fight or flee. It moves away from your skin, which is why your hands get clammy. And all of which I'm somewhat experiencing. And it corresponds to kind of neuronal firing, which is a slow build of like dun-dun, 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 dun-dun. Which, by the way, sharks are actually very great creatures, and they're actually very curious, and you're much more likely to die in a car accident if you're under 40. But that's a different story. So, I mean, you're not going to get eaten by a shark. You're more likely to die in a car accident. Most of you guys here. After 40, it's cancer. But that's a different story. And so fear it builds up slowly until it hits, and that's like distress. And that's constant and punishing. So out of the 6 negative emotions, they're all innately punishing, and they're designed to get you to do something different. And that's what Tompkins wrote about, to change what you're doing because it's not good. It figures 6 negative, 2 positive, 1 neutral. And why are there more negative affects than positive affects? Well, I mean, it's designed to help you survive. Because if you're just doing stuff that felt good, you'd probably get yourself into some trouble. So that's distress, and that's like punishing. That's tears, that's crying, that's upset. And then if that goes on for long enough, it shifts up to anger. And anger corresponds to redness of the face, again, sympathetic response, blood shunting, the face turns red. And then I often ask people, so when is the other time that the face turns red? Shame. And there's 4 ways that people react to shame. They withdraw, they avoid, they beat up on themselves, or they lash out at other people. So that, again, they withdraw, avoid, they beat up on themselves, or lash out at other people, or some combination of those. And then that only leaves us 2 more negative affects. One is smell disgust, ew. Unilateral clenching of the face and turning away, and ugh. And so why are those important? I mean, if it's just those 6 negative affects. So for smell, it's like somebody can introduce an idea that's not very attractive to you, and you're like, I don't know. Or they can say something that's really disgusting, like, let's go eat some grasshoppers. And, be like, ugh. And so if you watch somebody's face, it actually tells you quite a bit. So we've got fear, distress, anger, smell disgust, ugh, taste disgust. And then we've got the positive affects of interest. So if this is fear, interest is a little bit of a slower build. It's like a good joke, which I'm not a great teller of jokes, but if you think of somebody I like Louis C.K., he builds it up so much until it's like, oh my goodness, it almost hits distress. And then he lets it down with a punchline. And if it's a bad joke, you just chuckle. And if it's a really good joke, you laugh, and that's joy. It's a release of tension. So again, we've got interest and joy. We've got fear, distress, anger. Then we've got surprise. And surprise is used to reset our focus. It's, it's kind of like you don't want to be too scared or too interested if a lion's coming along and about to eat you. So it's used to reset your focus. And so it's kind of a very quick up and down. So I told you about 2 times that the face turns red. So one is anger, which is a sympathetic response, and there's shame, which is a parasympathetic response, which is a bringing down. Like you might be really excited about something, but it's designed to stop you from making a fool of yourself and causing trouble. And the other time that the face turns red is when people feel helpless. And you see this not only in addiction, which Lance Doty's wrote about, who happens to be in town where I live in Boston. So his model of addiction was essentially when we go through life going through a decision tree till we come to 2 choices. We go with the better of the 2 choices. Other times we come through a decision tree and we end up on 2 bad choices. And that's by definition a dilemma. And what that leaves us feeling is helpless. And that's one of the worst things you can do to a human being is make them feel helpless. And what happens is it triggers the affect of frustration, which can go to anger, distress, which can go to despair, until it snowballs because that reptile monkey brain gets activated until you say F it, and you decide to take an action, which could be punching a wall, going shopping, taking a nap, having a drink, shooting heroin. I do work with people in recovery, and when I describe that model to them, their face turns red. And I often point out to them, trying not to shame them, are you aware that your face is turning red? And 99% of the time they say no. But they say, like, you've explained exactly what happens, why I'm using substances. And I say, well, this is exactly why I can't, write opiates for myself or benzodiazepines, because it's all about access and it has nothing to do with any kind of morality. So it's a very different method, mode of looking at kind of helplessness and addiction. And it's really important, going back to the horse and the rider, to be aware of how your own internal state is feeling. That's the affect, which you're able to label as feeling. Because when you get to that F-it moment, you take an action in the short term that makes you feel better, but in the long term is not in line with your long-term goals. And so that's why I think we've all had the experience of when we're in that kind of tough space, call up a friend and say, like, look, this is this impossible dilemma I'm in. And they'll say, have you thought about blank? And you'll say, duh. Like, why didn't I think of that? Well, it's because your brain was shut down because your reptile monkey brain was running the show. And, reptile monkey brains do what reptile monkey brains do. And so, because action is the antidote to helplessness. So in that helpless moment, when you decide to take the action of the drink, the nap, the shopping, whatever it is, that's action. So you don't feel in that intolerable affective state. That's really important. And then the next point is about intimacy. And intimacy is being honest, trying to optimize positive affects with your partner and decrease negative affects with your partner, and being honest about communicating your affects. Let's see if I can make it to sex even in less than 3 minutes. And so part of what's really lacking in a lot of, intimate, physical contact is an honesty or an intimacy. And without communication, it makes it really hard to have a really good physical interaction with another human being. That's part of Dr. Chiké's sex talk, is if you can't talk about it, you really shouldn't be doing it. That goes from anywhere from kissing to whatever your imagination goes. And so, and I talk to this with teens, because I'm an adult and child psychiatrist, and they often blush and they get somewhat uncomfortable, and I get a bit uncomfortable, but I'm getting better. But really, it's not a judgment about what you should or shouldn't be doing, but if you're not able to talk about it, you shouldn't be doing it, because you're just going to have a bad physical interaction, because it lacks intimacy, and you're just not going to have a good time. So I'm all about people having a good time. The kids don't really believe it. When kids come in to see me, it's usually the worst time of their life. And I say, when you're coming to see me, life isn't going well for you. Your life isn't easy. If your life is easy, then my life isn't easy. Let's make your life more easy. And they laugh because they look at my office and it looks like I like to have fun, which I do, and make my life easy. Let's see if I can finish up in sexy. So the last thing is point and shoot. So going back to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, for a male to have an erection, he has to first have a parasympathetic response. That's to get the erection. And then to actually ejaculate, he has to have a sympathetic reaction. That's very hard if you're doing that with somebody you don't really know that well, which is tough. I grew up in a time where everybody was scared of dying of AIDS for sex, so it was a little bit different. And the current hookup, I've watched the term hookup change a lot over time. In my time, it could mean kissing. Now I think it just means sex. But it was just different. So I guess I finally got to sexy. I guess what I would say is, intimacy and communication is key. And knowing one's own internal body state, which is, feeling and being aware of the basic affects, is incredibly important if you want to have a good time. So thank you very much for having me.